Alright, so this is going to be a review of the study guide for the final exam in biological psychology. So remember that the final exam is going to have the same format as the midterm exam. So you'll have 80 points worth of multiple choice true-false questions, and then you'll also have 20 points worth of essay questions. So there'll be 2 essay questions listed, and you'll be able to choose which one you want to answer. And there will also be an extra credit opportunity on the final exam as well. So the final exam is also going to be similar to the midterm in the scope. So just like with the midterm, I've chosen a major topic from each of the chapters we've covered in the second half of the class, and that's going to be what you need to focus on for the final exam. So I'm going to go through here and kind of hit the highlights on these topics, but if you have questions, feel free to email me, let me know what you need. Alright, so Chapter 13 we split in half. The second half of Chapter 13, which was in the second half of the class, was on nutrition, digestion, that kind of thing. So the thing that I want you to focus on here is hormonal influences on appetite. There were a few major ones to think about here. So insulin is important for a couple of things. So first of all, your body cannot use glucose without insulin. Your brain is able to use glucose without insulin, but your body is not. So you need it for that purpose. You also need insulin to help you convert glucose to glycogen. So glucose, whenever you eat, you have that sugar, that's that major source of energy for your body. Your body is going to use whatever glucose it needs from the food that you've eaten. But if there is extra glucose, your body needs to be able to store that so that you can use it later. If there's been a time where you haven't eaten recently, your body needs extra energy, maybe you're exercising or something like that. So your body's going to be able to store that excess glucose as glycogen, a form that's easier to store. So insulin is necessary to convert glucose to glycogen, and then glucagon is going to reverse that process. So glucagon is another hormone that's going to take glycogen that's stored form and break it down into glucose, the form that your body can use. As far as leptin, ghrelin, and PYY336, once again, the person who was naming things was on vacation. What happens here is that these hormones impact your appetite, and leptin is going to be a longer lasting kind of effect versus ghrelin and PYY that are shorter term effects. So leptin is a hormone that is produced by fat cells. So if you think about that for a second, this is a long-term effect because your body fat percentage is not something that changes drastically very quickly. This is something that takes time. So long-lasting effects, leptin is produced by fat cells, and this is your body's way of keeping track of how much fat you have stored, so that if your leptin levels are high, then your body knows that you have sufficient or maybe even excess body fat stored, and so you don't need to consume extra calories. However, there is some evidence to say that issues with leptin can be related to individuals who are overweight. So perhaps their body is not able to understand the leptin, and perhaps that's part of the reason why a person might still be hungry even if they do have sufficient fat stores. So that's a longer term effect. And then ghrelin and PYY336 have short term effects. So this is something that waxes and wanes throughout the day. And so what you're going to see is that they work in opposition to each other. So ghrelin, you can think growth hormone releasing, if that helps you remember. So in addition to being related to the release of growth hormone, it's also going to stimulate your appetite. And that makes sense. If you think about this as something that's related to growth hormone, if it's something that's helping you to grow, then it's going to encourage you to eat, right? So if you are hungry, right, ghrelin levels are probably high, and then you eat, ghrelin levels should go down. But that, once again, might be something that's different in different individuals. And then PYY336 is going to be the opposite effect here. So it suppresses appetite. So if you have not eaten for a while, then PYY336 should be low because your body wouldn't want to suppress your appetite if you haven't eaten. But then once you eat, then PYY336 should kick in and increase so that you're not hungry, you don't keep eating because you've taken in enough food. Alright, so chapter 14 was on sleep, and the section that I chose for the final exam would be those neural systems that are responsible for sleep. So the major systems, we know that we have the forebrain, the reticular formation, and the pons, and then these are going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. So the forebrain in general and the basal forebrain in particular is associated with slow wave sleep or non-REM sleep. So remember, we use those terms pretty much interchangeably here. Remember that when you look at the pictures of an EEG for non-REM, it looks more like slow waves. So the basal forebrain is thought to be related to slow wave sleep. Couple of things that make us think that. One, general anesthesia produces a state that is similar to non-REM slow wave sleep. Okay, so what happens with general anesthesia is that it causes GABA to be released. So it's a GABA agonist. Remember that GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It calms things down, slows you down, relaxes you. And so this seems to cause GABA to be released in the basal forebrain. So the basal forebrain uses GABA to produce slow wave sleep. We also know this because of that research where you separated various parts of the brain from the body in animals and studied how this impacted their sleep-wake cycles. So remember that an isolated brain in general was capable of producing waking sleep, REM sleep, non-REM sleep, all of that. So we know then that sleep is going to be controlled by the brain, that the brain, even if separated from the body, is still able to sleep and wake. But when you isolate the forebrain from the rest of the brain in the body, you'll see that the person will not, or I shouldn't say person, the subject, the animal, this was done with animals, the animal would not be able to have that normal REM sleep or waking, but they would have that slow wave sleep. So slow wave sleep is something that seems to be caused by the basal forebrain. And slow wave sleep, once again, referring to non-REM sleep. All right, then if the basal forebrain helps us go to sleep, now remember that for a typical person, you go non-REM, 1, 2, 3, and then REM. So you fall into non-REM sleep. That's your transition from waking to sleep is non-REM sleep. So your typical individual is going to be able to go back and forth between being awake and being asleep here with a reticular formation causing them to wake. So if you stimulate the reticular formation, that will cause an individual to wake up. If there is a lesion, damaged area to the reticular formation, then that will prevent the individual from waking up. And then the pons is going to be important for REM sleep. So remember that REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep, that this is a time when your brain is very active. So it looks, if you're looking at an EEG, it looks very similar to a waking brain. But one thing that you'll also note about REM sleep is that an individual's muscles are supposed to be paralyzed while an individual is in REM sleep so that they're not acting out their dreams. So the pons is important for helping an individual have that REM sleep, which is when an individual dreams, but then also it's important for making sure that the muscles remain flaccid during REM sleep so that you're not acting out your dreams. So we have a portion of the brain that causes non-REM sleep, a portion of the brain that causes REM sleep, a portion of the brain that helps wake us up, and then you have the hypothalamus that is sort of in control. Once again, the hypothalamus is important for homeostasis. Sleep is an important part of maintaining that balance. So the hypothalamus is going to control the transition between waking and different types of sleep. One way to study anything, as we've talked about, is studying where it goes wrong. So with an individual who has narcolepsy, this is a person who has difficulty with this transition between waking and sleeping. So they'll have sudden sleep attacks where they are not gradually easing into sleep at a typical time, but they're falling into sleep very quickly, and not just falling into sleep, but falling into REM sleep, which is very unusual. Normally you go into non-REM sleep first. So one thing that we've seen is that narcolepsy is associated with issues with hypocretin, which is something that's going to be secreted by the hypothalamus, and those neurons that secrete hypocretin, there we go, they're going to be damaged to individuals who have narcolepsy. So this tells us that in a typical individual who does not have narcolepsy, the hypothalamus is going to use hypocretin and potentially other things as well to control the transition between waking and sleeping. All right, chapter 15 was on stress and emotions. I decided to focus on the impact of stress. So we talked about the alarm reaction. This is what happens initially in your body when you have a stressful situation that you encounter. So your body is going to have that fight or flight mode that's going to kick in. It's going to help you handle a stressful situation. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to be released as part of that alarm reaction, and they're going to be released very quickly, and they're going to have shorter term effects. So this will cause that increase in heart rate, that increase in blood pressure, all the things that you need to be able to handle a stressful situation, to run or to fight, that kind of thing. But they're going to have shorter term effects. And then cortisol is something that's going to take longer to be released, but then it's going to also have longer lasting effects. So the alarm reaction is a combination of short-term effects and long-term effects where your body is preparing itself to handle the stressful situation. Now, one interesting concept that we talked about was stress immunization. So stress immunization is the concept that having small bits of stress that you're exposed to earlier in life can help an individual be more resilient to stress later. Now, a couple of important things to note here. With stress immunization, you need to have some stress early in life in order to have that resiliency later, but that's not the only thing you need. You need to have some level of stress, and you also need to have affection and be taught coping skills. So the way that they did this research was with baby rats, and the baby rats that were exposed to stress and then left alone were less resilient later. So it's not just the exposure to stress that causes you to be resilient later, but the baby rats that were exposed to stress and then were comforted by their mother were more resilient later. So it's not just being exposed to stress, but it's also being taught coping skills and having that affectionate response to stress early in life. So don't just intentionally stress out kids and say, hey, that's good for them. All right? Bullying is not good for anybody. The idea here is that if we go through a stressful period, we need to have someone love on us, care for us, give us coping skills, and then that will cause us to be more resilient later. Okay. But once again, you do need that stress. So having that loving, affectionate, which is good, by all means, be loving and affectionate. But you're not going to have an increase in resiliency later unless you have both. You need the loving, affectionate coping skills, and you also need low levels of stress. Okay. Risk factors for heart issues. One thing we talked about was the type A individuals. So those perfectionist, control freak kind of individuals are the ones that are more at risk for heart issues. And we said that the factor that was especially associated with type A and heart issues was hostility, right? So the other issues weren't that big of a deal, but hostility in particular was one that we need to try to reduce if at all possible. But then other things, we talked about social isolation, issues with sleep, depression, anxiety disorders. All these things can cause a person to have an increased risk, as well as a loss of purpose or a lack of purpose in life. So wondering, what am I here for and what is my reason for being here is also associated with an increased risk for heart issues. All right, as far as stress in the immune system, and this kind of plays into this next point here, and once I should apologize, my kids are playing outside with my husband while I'm recording this, and if you can hear them, I'm sorry. They're just outside having a good time. It's better that they're outside than inside while I'm recording this. Okay, so as far as stress in the immune system, your immune system is considered a lower priority when you're faced with a threat. So your body is going to put its initial all of its energy and resources into fighting or running away. And so things like fertility, things like immune system, growth, all those things in that moment are considered less important. Like, we'll come back to that later. Right now, we need to survive this. So we know that stress is going to suppress the immune system, which in the short term might be a good thing, but in the long term is a bad thing. More on that in a second. So we talked a little bit about the immune system, about the different components here. We talked about phagocytes, about how they surround the invaders and destroy them, engulf them, and that's good. We talked about those B cells that produce antibodies and those T cells that can be killer T cells and can attack the invaders, or they can also be helper T cells and help produce more white blood cells, all those things. And that immune system is going to be suppressed when an individual is going through a period of stress. So I put table 15.1 here. You have table 15.1 in your notes. Even if you don't have the textbook, it's in the notes. So table 15.1 is a good summary of this point, that in the moment when your body is trying to escape from a dangerous situation, the consequences are important and good. But later, if you have long-term chronic stress that never lets up, then that's going to cause some long-term issues. So, for example, initially, your body doesn't need to be focused on the immune system. It needs to be focused on getting away from the attacker. But if you stay stressed out for a long period of time, that long-term suppression of your immune system can cause a variety of health conditions you'll be at an increased risk for. Fertility. In the moment, you need to get away from the dangerous situation. Fertility should not be on your mind. However, if you have long-term chronic stress, then this can reduce fertility long-term. If you are in that moment where something dangerous is happening, then you need that increased blood pressure, heart rate, etc. to help you survive. But if you have that increased heart rate, blood pressure over time, then that can cause those cardiovascular issues. So you can look at table 15.1 and get a good summary of that. All right, chapter 16 was our chapter on psychopathology. It primarily focused on schizophrenia. That's what I want you guys to focus on for the final exam. So remember that schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder where you have those positive symptoms like hallucinations, delusions, some interesting speech things that are going on there, like making up words and repeating words, that kind of thing. And then you also have negative symptoms. So you have people who have loss of motivation, loss of pleasure, that's anhedonia, loss of interest in social contact, lack of eye contact, all of that good stuff. So when we're talking about schizophrenia, there are several potential causes. We don't really know for sure. It's a complicated issue. But one thing we did mention was environmental causes. So we do see that individuals who had that increased stressors. So we talked about how it's possible that we have a genetic predisposition plus a stressor in the environment equals disorder, and that a person might have a genetic predisposition, but if they don't have the stress in their environment, they might never develop the disorder. And that's why not every identical twin who has a twin with schizophrenia will go on to develop schizophrenia themselves. So environmental causes, stress, issues at birth, low birth weight, developmental problems. Also, we could say exposure to flu could be an environmental cause. I mean, that's something that's biological, but not something you're born with, something you come in contact in the environment. We do see that if a woman who is pregnant is exposed to the flu more intensely than typical, that does increase the risk of the child going on to have schizophrenia. But that's correlational. And then also paternal age. So we talked about the fact that we usually think about maternal age as being an issue, and it can be for sure, but paternal age, an older father is more likely to have a child with schizophrenia. The hypofrontality hypothesis. So we do see that individuals who have schizophrenia tend to have less gray matter in the frontal lobes, and then also just general decreased activity here that we would measure on a functional MRI. So the frontal lobes are so important for a lot of things, personality and attention and impulse control, and all these things that you can see are related to schizophrenia. So it is possible that issues with the frontal lobe cause symptoms of schizophrenia. And then this could be then connected with the idea of a lobotomy, which is not done anymore. Obviously, we talked about the horrors of lobotomies in class. But you could see how if we knew there was an issue with frontal lobes, there's at least some kind of at least you can see, it's not a justification, but you can see why people thought doing something to the frontal lobes would help. Although I don't see why poking them with an ice pick was thought to be helpful. But anyway, that's not the point. Let me know if you have questions. All right, dopamine hypothesis. This is a very prominent hypothesis for where psychotic disorders come from. So with the dopamine hypothesis, we say that there's too much activation of dopamine. So maybe there's an excess of dopamine that's being released, or the dopamine receptors, maybe there's too many receptors, they're too sensitive, something like that. So evidence for this, one thing that we see is that if an individual has Parkinson's disease, that is associated with a very decreased amount of dopamine. So we give the person L-DOPA, those precursors to dopamine, to try to help reduce the symptoms of Parkinson's. But what we find is that by giving them the precursors to dopamine, if you go too far with that, you can cause symptoms of schizophrenia. So that then causes, there's one piece of evidence for the dopamine hypothesis. If you increase dopamine, that can cause symptoms of schizophrenia. That's very related to the amphetamine psychosis bit of information here, that if you give an individual a drug, and many stimulants do this, if you give them a drug that increases dopamine, that can cause psychotic symptoms that look similar to schizophrenia. So once again, that's another piece of evidence for the dopamine hypothesis. Also, the first generation typical antipsychotics were all dopamine antagonists, so decreasing the activity of dopamine, and they did seem to be helpful, at least for positive symptoms. So all of that could be taken as evidence for the dopamine hypothesis, but the dopamine hypothesis is not perfect. One issue with the dopamine hypothesis is that the change in the amount of dopamine happens very quickly, but yet it takes a while to get symptom relief. And this is similar to SSRIs, the same thing. The change in serotonin is quick, but the symptoms may not get better for a few weeks. So we know that if you give someone an antipsychotic, it decreases dopamine very quickly, but it may take a while for those symptoms to go away. Also, there are some individuals who do not respond to typical antipsychotics, may not respond to them at all, and certainly negative symptoms of schizophrenia don't tend to respond very well to typical antipsychotics. And then finally, atypical or second-generation antipsychotics have been found to be effective and less dangerous, so they're much more likely to be diagnosed these days because there are fewer side effects. There are still some side effects, but fewer side effects. But the atypical antipsychotics, although many of them do decrease dopamine, not all of them do. And there are some that, even if they increase dopamine, can still be effective at treating schizophrenia. The ones that do work on dopamine also work on serotonin as well. And the thought is that second generations antipsychotics tend to work well for positive and sort of okay for negative symptoms as well. And then the glutamate hypothesis here, this is something that is actually related to the dopamine hypothesis. So what we're saying with the dopamine hypothesis is that you have too much dopamine activity. With the glutamate hypothesis, we're saying you don't have enough glutamate activity. So we see here drugs like PCP and ketamine that decrease glutamate can cause symptoms of schizophrenia. But this seems to be related in that there is a possible connection here. If you increase dopamine levels to an excessive point, that can then work to decrease glutamate. So these two things could be related to each other. All right, for chapter 17, types of memory. So we talked about sensory memory or sensory buffers. This is the first step. Everything that's coming in your environment comes into sensory memory. So it has a large capacity but a very brief duration. Most of the things that are coming into your senses don't make it past sensory memory. The things that you pay attention to are going to make it into your short-term memory. Now, your short-term memory is, just like it says, short-term is going to have a brief duration, although the duration of short-term memory will be longer than the duration of sensory memory. Sensory memory can last from a fraction of a second to maybe a few seconds, depending on which sense we're talking about. Short-term memory can last up to 30 seconds or indefinitely if you're doing rehearsal. So with short-term memory, if you are repeating a phone number over and over until you can find a pencil and write it down, you could repeat that number over and over and over indefinitely. And as long as you keep repeating it, it will stay in your short-term memory. So rehearsal keeps something in your short-term memory indefinitely, but if you get distracted or you try to do something else, then you might lose it. But as long as you're rehearsing it, you can keep it in your short-term memory. So then long-term memory is something that's going to be, just like it sounds, it's going to have a longer duration and a larger capacity as well, the largest capacity. So there are a few different types of long-term memory. General breakdown here, declarative would be explaining something to someone else, telling something, versus non-declarative, you can't really explain it, so you have to show it to another person. So with declarative memory, we talked about episodic and semantic. Now remember that we know that there are different types of memory because of individuals who've had various surgeries or traumatic brain injuries where they have had damage and they've lost certain types of memories. We talked about how one individual had maintained his semantic memory but had lost his episodic memory. So episodic memory would be your personal memory, the memories of what you did for your last birthday, what you did for Christmas, whatever, something that's specific to you, versus semantic information, which is general knowledge. So we talked about state capitals, we could talk about presidents, we could talk about just facts. You memorize facts. So this is declarative I'll get talking correctly in a second, perhaps. Declarative memory, because it's something you can tell to another person. But it's not episodic because it's not unique to you. These are general facts. On the other hand, we have non-declarative memory, which is memory that you show to another person, not something you can tell another person. Different things listed here. It talks about skill learning. So we know that there's a difference between declarative and non-declarative memory, in part because of HM. So remember that HM had severe seizures. He had large portions of his temporal lobes removed. And he lost the ability to form new declarative memories, but he could still form new non-declarative memories. Even though he couldn't remember having practiced the skill before, if he did practice the skill, he would get better at it, even though he couldn't tell you about when he had first completed that skill. So skill learning, we talked about things like reading mirror reversed text, or tracing something in a mirror. This could be a musical skill. This could be riding a bicycle. Skill learning. Priming is the concept that if you've had an earlier exposure to the stimulus, that will change your response to a related stimulus later. So, for example, with HM, they would read him a list of words. And, for example, your textbook says one of those words might have been stamp. Now, later, he won't remember that you read a list of words to him. But if they say, all right, HM, we want you to make up a word, and the first 3 letters have to be STA, then he's more likely to say stamp than any other STA word. Now, that's something they had to do over and over and over again to replicate it, but this is non-declarative memory because he did not remember you reading that list of words to him, and yet having heard the word recently primed him and made him more likely to use that word later. And then associative learning here, this talked about classical conditioning. So the general idea behind classical conditioning is learning that 2 things go together. So what you learn is that an unconditioned stimulus is going to go with a conditioned stimulus. That's what you're learning. You're learning the association between those 2 things. The conditioned stimulus was originally neutral, but now it has become conditioned because of its association with the unconditioned stimulus. So, unconditioned stimulus of the food, if we're talking about Pavlov, unconditioned stimulus of the food causes the unconditioned response of the dog drooling, salivating. Natural, no training needed. What happens is we take something like a bell that's originally neutral and we pair it with the unconditioned stimulus. Ring the bell, give the food. Ring the bell, give the food. Over time, the individual, dog, whatever we're talking about here, will learn that association, and the bell will become a conditioned stimulus capable of producing a conditioned response of salivating. So salivating is an unconditioned response when it happens to something natural, like the food, and a conditioned response when it happens to something you had to learn to respond to, like the bell. But this happens because you learned an association between the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus that became conditioned. You learned an association between the food and the bell, and that's why you can now salivate to a bell. Okay, that's a really quick summary. We talked about it in class. Let me know if you have questions. All right. Chapter 18, disorders related to attention. So Chapter 18 was all about attention. We talked about 3 major disorders here. Hemispatial neglect happens when an individual has damage, usually to the right hemisphere. We talked about how attention tends to be localized more on the right side. So with hemispatial neglect, if you have damage to an area in the right hemisphere, this usually is something that happens only on the right hemisphere. Then you start having symptoms where an individual loses the left side of their world. So they tend to neglect the left side of their body. They might not finish dressing the left side of their body. When they copy pictures, they don't draw the left side of the pictures. Now, once again, this is a rare disorder, but it is something that we see. We talked about extinction here. In this particular context, we were talking about the fact that an individual might only notice a stimulus if it happens on one side, like they'll only notice one side. So if you have a picture on both sides of the individual, they'll only see it on the right side. If you have a person walk up on either side, they'll only see the person on the right side. If you have something cold on both arms, they'll only feel it on the right arm. So they tend to have lost the left side of their world. And anosognosia, wow, there we go. One that's kind of tough to say, anosognosia. This is a denial of illness. So these individuals tend to say that they are typical functioning, there's nothing wrong, They would deny that there's any issue with them. All right, Balint's syndrome here, this is something that is even more rare. So Balint's syndrome requires damage on both sides, like bilateral damage. So it's important to note that a disorder that requires damage to the exact same area on both sides is going to be fairly rare. If there's a disorder that only requires damage to a particular area on one side, that's more likely than having disorder that requires damage to the same area on both sides. That's something that doesn't happen very frequently. But Balint's syndrome here is an individual that has issues. Maybe they've had a stroke or they've had some kind of damage. That's the particular area that's in the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe being damaged a little bit here as well. So what's happening here, a variety of symptoms you can see, difficulty voluntarily steering their gaze. So it's hard for them to focus their eyes where they want them to go. If they have difficulty focusing their eyes, it'll also be difficult for them to reach out and grab objects. So depth perception can be an issue here. And then also they can have issues with paying attention to just one particular component at a time. And so maybe they only see a particular part of your face. They don't see your entire face. They get zero focused in on details and can't see the whole picture. All right, and then we talked about ADHD. Of all the disorders related to attention, this is the one that is most commonly diagnosed and probably the one we've heard of the most. So one thing that's important to note is that an ADHD diagnosis is only appropriate if a person has dysfunction. So if you have issues with attention but it's not causing you any problems, that's not ADHD. You have to have dysfunction. So some individuals will have the hyperactive impulsive type. Some individuals will have the inattentive type. And then some individuals will have a combined type where you have issues with attention and issues with hyperactivity. So those are presentations. You can have an inattentive presentation, the hyperactive impulsive presentation, or a combined presentation where you have both. We do tend to see a correlation here with reduced brain volume. Not a huge percentage, I think 3 or 4% is what we talked about in class, but this is something that can happen in the cerebellum, in the frontal lobes, areas where we can see a difference here. But that's correlational, so we don't know causation there. One thing we spent some time talking about is that map in our textbook that showed that there is a vast difference in diagnoses between different states. So this tells us that we don't have a great definition of ADHD and that perhaps our definition of ADHD is more tied to our expectations of how children should behave. And so we saw that especially the Southeast was an area, the East in general, but the Southeast compared with other parts of the country had higher rates of ADHD diagnoses. And then our last topic, Table 19.1 is in your notes a couple of times, and that gives a nice summary of different types of aphasia. So aphasia in general is a loss of language that happens because of some type of brain injury, some type of impairment there. Now, paraphasia is the least severe. So with paraphasia, a person might insert some incorrect sounds or words, but for the most part, their production and comprehension is not severely damaged. So that would be considered the least severe. The other ones we talked about, non-fluent aphasia or Broca's aphasia happens because of damage to Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe, almost always on the left side. So we said that usually an individual's language centers are on the left side. That's not true for everyone and a little bit less likely to be true for left-handed people, but typically they're on the left side of the brain. So Broca's area, if you have damage there, the person will have non-fluent aphasia. So they'll be able to understand you fairly well, but they'll have difficulty in producing speech. So it will take them a long time to speak, and they may not be able to say exactly what they want to say. This is contrasted a bit with fluent aphasia, which is resulted from damage to Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is in the left, usually on the left, temporal lobe, but it also has some areas of the parietal lobe that could be included as well. So Wernicke's aphasia causes an individual to have very poor comprehension. They can't really understand language well, and then also they have a difficult time producing meaningful speech. Now it's called fluent because they are able to speak easily. there's not that halting delay that you'll see with non-fluent aphasia. They're able to speak easily, but the words that they're using tend to be nonsense words, or they're very confusing. It's hard for you to understand them, but they can produce speech. We also talked about issues with the angular gyrus. So the angular gyrus is thought to, and there goes my husband's cell phone ringing, because, you know, it's real life happening while I'm recording. Hang on a sec. Oh well, I'm so glad you guys know me in real life, and so you know this is just me. Alright, fantastic. Okay, so the angular gyrus. Yes, back to lecture. The angular gyrus is thought to be the connection between the visual areas and the auditory areas. So it could be connecting parts of the occipital lobe to parts of the temporal lobe. Alright, and then global aphasia is something that is kind of a combination of other types of aphasia. The person will have total loss of language or near total loss of language. So with global aphasia, there was an example in the textbook of a woman who spoke 6 languages but lost all of them, including her inner monologue. Like, it was difficult for her to even think the same way that other people typically do. This is something that's very rare and only happens if very large portions of the left hemisphere, so basically all of the language centers, being damaged. And then conduction aphasia was one that was interesting because it's part of that connectionist model of language. The idea that it's not enough to have functioning language centers, you also need language centers to be connected to each other. So the arcuate fasciculus was believed to be a connection between Broca's and Wernicke's area. Now, we did say that for most individuals, we know now that the Broca's area and Wernicke's area are not completely attached, not completely connected by the arcuate fasciculus. But still, we do see that the arcuate fasciculus does lie in between Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And if there's damage to that area, a person will have difficulty repeating words. So they'll understand. Wernicke's area will allow them to understand what you're saying. And Broca's area will allow them to produce speech as long as it's their own speech. But it's hard for them to make a connection between those two areas to understand what you're saying and then produce what you're saying. It's very difficult for them to do that. Alright, so this has been a review for the final exam for biological. I apologize for the phone ringing and for my kids potentially being loud outside, but I hope this was helpful for you. If you have questions, please feel free to let me know, and I will see you guys for the final exam. Have a great day.